Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, a Latter-day Saint apostle stood trial in the American capital, Washington, D.C. Now, it wasn't a legal proceeding, but a political hearing, and the resulting investigation transformed the LDS Church, and the outcome cemented the faith's place within the United States. Today, I'd like to tell you the story about Reed Smoot's trial when he was elected to the Senate in 1903. It's a moment that epitomized Mormonism's transition from a parochial, polygamous, and theocratic kingdom in the 19th century into a democratic, monogamous, and assimilated community in the 20th century. It featured a national anti-Mormon campaign, backroom bargaining, and culminated in the removal of 2 LDS apostles. At one point, several members of the Quorum of the 12 questioned whether Joseph F. Smith, the prophet of the time, was leading the church in the right direction. So if you're looking for some of the most consequential moments in Mormon history, it would be hard to find a more consequential moment than Reed Smoot's trial. So let's dig in. First, we need a bit of background and context. All of this is taking place in the wake of Wilford Woodruff's 1890 Manifesto, where remember, after decades of the LDS Church protesting that practicing polygamy was their religious liberty. And once the federal government had sent its full force to eradicate the practice, Wilford Woodruff in 1890 issued the manifesto saying that the LDS Church would no longer solemnize plural marriages, and in the ensuing years they tried to assimilate into American politics and American culture rather than standing unique. But questions still remained, especially in the political sphere. Now, the Mormons had given up their political party. They had created a political party, the People's Party, in the 1870s, and they disposed of that in the early 1890s, their tepid move toward embracing America's two-party system. And as I've detailed in previous videos, there was an early alliance between LDS leaders and the Republican Party that would later bear fruits decades later. And at least during the 1890s, the LDS Church proved quite pragmatic in working within this new framework, always making sure that there were moderate politicians and not church leaders elected to major offices. Though there was one exception in 1898 when B.H. Roberts, the famous LDS leader, theologian, and historian, was elected to Utah's congressional seat and was denied his seat in Washington, D.C. on the grounds that he was a polygamist, and therefore they said he was unlawful, and maybe a story for another video, he did not receive as much support from the church, especially the church's women's, due to debates between Roberts and women over women's suffrage during Utah's statehood convention, and so B.H. Roberts was evicted from Congress in 1898. But a few years later, things seemed different. After the 20th century dawned, and now Joseph F. Smith became the president of the church, and he seemed to see it as his mission to help assimilate the church onto firmer ground. And one of the ways he thought they could do it would be for the state to elect Reed Smoot as one of their senators. Now remember, this is back when the general population did not directly vote on senators. Instead, you would vote for the state legislatures, and then the state legislators would vote on senators. So in January of 1903, with the church's support, Reed Smoot, who was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, was elected Utah's senator, which raised the question of, is that even a good thing? Before we go much further, I want to remind you that if you enjoy this type of historical nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. And if you want to give back due to the hours that I and my wonderful producer Anthony put in, you can become a member. Also, if you want to keep track of all my activities, including my videos here, my productions on social media channels, my interviews, my public lectures, make sure you are subscribed to my Kit newsletter, which you can find in the video description. All right, let's get back to the history. So here you see a picture of Reed Smoot, who, as I mentioned, was ordained an apostle a few years before this moment. In many ways, Smoot represented the new era of Mormon leaders. He was monogamous. He did not have any plural wives. He was seen as moderate. He was not seen as radical as several of his colleagues. And he was a Republican, which meant he got along with the church leaders who were trying to forge this alliance with the Republican Party at the time. However, there were many in the nation who would have rejected any potential candidate coming out of Utah who were a part of the LDS hierarchy. And there was a renewed evangelical anti-Mormon push in the early 1900s who were terrified that Mormons were becoming too much assimilated, or that they were being accepted and that was going to allow their heresies to spread wide. And so there was a massive petition campaign once Reed Smoot was elected saying that America needs to set its foot down, stop this heresy, and evict the Mormons. And some even evoked the language of exterminate, going all the way back to Missouri and Little Burn Bogs, because Mormons were a menace, they were a nuisance, they were a cancer that had to be rid. But even in the more rational quarters of America, who weren't taking on this tinge of evangelical anti-Mormonism, there was skepticism in political quarters that Mormons had done enough to fully integrate into society, which would allow them to have their own religious leaders participate in electoral politics. Most importantly, there are questions around the polygamy. Did Mormons go back on their promise to stop practicing polygamy after 1890? And were they using Reed Smoot to gain more cultural acceptance while hiding their more nefarious practices? Here's one of my favorite political cartoons from the moment that shows the LDS patriarch whose robe is filled with all the horrors of Mormonism's past, trying to sneak Reed Smoot into Congress as a way to downplay what the lack of their remorse for what they had done in the decades before this. So after Reed Smoot is elected in January of 1903, there is a congressional committee appointed to investigate. And very quickly, it is apparent that they are not so much investigating Reed Smoot as they are the LDS Church. Notably, have the Mormons stayed true to their word on polygamy? Were they successfully assimilating into American culture and accepting all the parameters that meant? Could Mormons, in other words, ever fit within America's political, religious, and cultural body? Now, Joseph F. Smith believed addressing those questions was crucial for the church to get on firmer standing, but it raised a much larger storm than he had expected. So let's get into some of the particular disputes that were at the heart of these congressional hearings. Much of it, as I've already mentioned, revolved around polygamy, but there were two fronts to that question. The first major issue was a disagreement over Mormons who entered plural marriages prior to 1890 were allowed to keep those marital relations after the manifesto. And that came down to a misinterpretation or a disagreement over Mormon and political authorities in the earliest amnesty discussions that took place in 1891 and 1892, when George Buchanan and other LDS leaders met with national representatives to hammer out these amnesty agreements to make sure that Latter-day Saints could move forward without the fear of prosecution. Latter-day Saints left those meetings with an understanding, and I think a genuine belief, that so long as they did not solemnize new plural marriages, they could remain in their old plural marriages. However, federal officials left, and I think genuinely believing that, well, the Latter-day Saints had agreed that they would not participate in any of these plural families, and those previous plural families would be dissolved, something that was anathema to Latter-day Saints, because they're like, these are my wives, these are my children, I'm not going to break up these families. In fact, this became so central that around the time of the Reed Smoot trials, Joseph F. Smith, president at the time, was arrested for cohabitation when one of his youngest wives gave birth, evidence that he was still having marital relations with plural wives. But it seems like they came to a formal agreement around this time of the Reed Smoot trials that, okay, we're going to ignore the marriages that were solemnized before 1890, and we're just going to focus on the question of whether Mormons are still creating new plural marriages after Woodruff's manifesto. And it turns out the Mormons weren't doing too well on that either. As I've detailed in previous videos, there were lots of post-manifesto polygamous sealings, probably a couple, if not several hundred of them, including LDS leaders. Wilford Woodruff himself likely took on an additional plural wife after he issued his own manifesto, and the Quorum of the 12 oversaw the creation of these networks where they would send families down to Mexico or up to Canada, or even solemnize new plural marriages in Utah itself. And very early on in the congressional investigations, there was enough evidence that 3 apostles had done more than others, although there were plenty of apostles like Anthony Ivins who had done some who didn't get the attention. But there was at least evidence on 3 apostles who were deeply involved in post-manifesto polygamous sealings. Mariner Merrill, who is an older apostle, he was the president of the Logan Temple for a while, and solemnized plenty of plural marriages within his family, with himself, and with others. And then 2 younger apostles, John W. Taylor, the son of the LDS prophet John Taylor, and Matthias Cowley. And the fact that 2 of those 3 apostles who received so much attention were younger apostles demonstrated that it was not just a generational issue and that it was going to continue. And so all 3 apostles were summoned to testify in Washington, D.C., along with lots of other apostles, but those 3 refused. Merrill was older, he was in ill health, so he got an exemption, but John W. Taylor, who ran away to Canada rather than testify, and Matthias Cowley, who just hid, they became a constant thorn. Another issue at the heart of these debates was Mormon involvement with politics. Were the Mormons still dominating and dictating the political activities and votes of their congregants? Here's one political cartoon of Joseph F. Smith, the prophet at the time, using Reed Smoot as a puppet, demonstrating this idea, the remnant of theocracy. So there's a question of, were Mormons willing to embrace the American tradition of individual conscience rather than giving their loyalty and their allegiance to church leaders and voting accordingly? And one key point of that was the rumors, and that was based on some evidence, that Latter-day Saints participated in an oath of vengeance in church temples, meaning as part of the endowment session, they took an oath to avenge the loss of Joseph Smith. Some variations of this in the news was that they were trying to avenge the loss of Joseph Smith against the American government or against just those who killed him. I'm going to do a whole video at some point in the future talking about the vengeance oath and blood atonement and how that was played in. But what's important here is this played into the much larger story of, were Mormons able to participate in the American body politic? Here's a political cartoon from the time showing Reed Smoot hiding behind the Salt Lake City temple saying, "These are sacred rituals I can't participate in, therefore I can't answer any questions." So to address all these issues, among the hundreds of Mormons who were called to testify in Washington, D.C., was Joseph F. Smith himself, the president of the church, testifying in front of the congressional hearing. Here is a cartoon of that to show his idea or his attitude going into it. They say that he wore a pin on his lapel of his slain father, Hiram Smith, who he always said was killed as part of a political conspiracy. So he is going in the belly of the beast to talk to the people that he believed were responsible for the death of his father decades before. And there was lots of public fascination with this. Everyone talked about his large family. Here's a portrait of Joseph F. Smith and his large family from around this time. But Joseph F. Smith, even though they said that he'd stared down those people in those congressional rooms, he gave answers that were meant to satiate or satisfy Congress, saying that, well, we're just acting like any other American religion. I don't dictate how they should vote. We have given up polygamy. We are just an average run-of-the-mill Christian group. When asked, as a prophet, do you receive revelations that dictate things? He actually downplayed, I don't know if I've received these prophecies. All meant to kind of quell the suspicion, although it did cause some problems back home. And so Joseph F. Smith had to go home back to Utah after the news of his testimony spread abroad, including Utah newspapers. And Joseph F. Smith had to address General Conference saying, no, I still believe in the true teachings. So you can see this conflicting allegiance between Joseph F. Smith trying to solve the contemporary problem, but still maintain these key doctrines and traditions within the LDS Church. It would be difficult to overstate how much division this whole political ordeal caused within the LDS hierarchy. There were several within the LDS Church who, like Joseph F. Smith, believed that these were necessary trials to finally put the church in better standing with the nation, while others believed that this was not worth it and that they were conceding too much. On the one hand, you had Reed Smoot himself, the politician who was so frustrated with the church saying that we're not practicing polygamy anymore, but then still solemnizing plural marriages. And he would express his disgust in letters to Joseph F. Smith. And then you had other apostles who were writing Joseph F. Smith saying, give this up. I don't see any benefit coming from this. We are giving up our sacred doctrines. We need to stay true to that rather than pledge full allegiance to the American nation. Eventually, a lot of this fight was over the nature of Wilford Woodruff's manifesto, and there were several meetings of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency over whether Woodruff's manifesto superseded Joseph Smith's revelation on plural marriage, now known as D&C 132. Some saying that Joseph Smith's revelation on plural marriage takes precedence and that Woodruff's manifesto was just a PR stunt, while others said that no, that is continuing revelation. The Woodruff manifesto, it is what is binding. Eventually, even with that disagreement still in place, Joseph F. Smith decided he had to replicate Woodruff's manifesto and issue another statement, which he did in April of 1904, just a year into the Reed Smoot hearings. He issued a proclamation that came to be known as the Second Manifesto. I'll put the text up on the screen. Inasmuch as there are a number of reports in circulation that plural marriages have been entered into, contrary to the official declaration of President Woodruff on September 24, 1890, commonly called the Manifesto, which was issued by President Woodruff and adopted by the Church at its General Conference, October 6, 1890, which forbade any marriages violative of the law of the land, I, Joseph F. Smith, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hereby affirm and declare that no such marriages have been solemnized with the sanction, consent, or knowledge of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Let me pause there. First of all, that is way too long of a run-on sentence. As a professor, I would, have marked that down for a bit for its grammatical usage. It's also not true, right? The church had solemnized plural marriages since 1890, so this is a dodge meant to satisfy the federal government. But then going on, because this is a key part. And I hereby announce that all such marriages are prohibited, and if any officer or member of the church shall assume or solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the church, and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof, and excommunication therefrom. That statement was a bit more truthful, that they were going to try to stop these plural marriages, although not fully, as I'll get into later, but they were really going to try to punish those that continued that practice of plural marriage because it was still causing political problems. That manifesto, the Second Manifesto, had lots of dissent within the Quorum of the 12 who believed that it was as much as an affront to their core doctrines as Wilford Woodruff's was back in 1890. Debates within the Quorum of the 12 continued for another year or so, and then finally in late 1905, Joseph F. Smith became convinced through dealings with Congress and the Quorum of the 12 that this dissent was never going to get better, and it was finally time to cut off those not willing to get on board with this new initiative. Most importantly, John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley, the two apostles, they represented the young generation that was unwilling to move on, and therefore they had to be cut off. Now, there were several apostles who were pleading for Joseph F. Smith not to take that stance, including Heber J. Grant, who would later become an LDS prophet and is often seen as a more moderate, pragmatic leader. He writes a letter to Joseph F. Smith during this time saying, "Please do not punish those brethren, Taylor and Cowley. What they have done, I have also done or intended to do." Think about that language there. But Joseph F. Smith felt it was necessary. So in October 1905, he asked for both Taylor and Cowley to submit resignations to the Quorum of the 12. And then Mariner Merrill, remember the older apostle who was a point of national attention, died shortly afterward due to old age. Joseph F. Smith then presented those resignations to the LDS Church General Conference in April 1906, which shocked attendees, and then replaced those three apostles, Taylor, Cowley, and Merrill, with 3 monogamous apostles, George Richards, Orson Whitney, and David O. McKay, who would later become president. So by doing that, that seemed to satisfy the federal government's insistence that we need to have some evidence that you really mean it, that you're moving on from polygamy. In total, the Senate hearings lasted for 4 years, from 1903 until 1907. The official record of those hearings, which included over 100 Mormons interviewed, including apostles and the President Joseph F. Smith, that official report totaled 3,500 pages. And to get a sense of the national attention, when you put together all the petitions that were sent by people across the nation saying, please don't allow this Mormon senator to be seated, those petitions fill 11 feet of shelf space in the U.S. archives, the largest such collection in the United States archives. Now, in 1907, the committee that was assigned to do the investigation actually voted to remove Smoot from his seat. However, when it then went to the larger Senate, the entire Senate, they voted overwhelmingly to allow Reed Smoot to retain that seat, showing that the Latter-day Saints had done enough to earn their space within the nation. Most importantly, Smoot had proven himself useful to the Republican Party. Unlike B.H. Roberts, who was never allowed to act in his seat while the hearing for his seat was going on, Reed Smoot was allowed to work as a senator while the congressional hearings were taking place. And he proved that he earned friends, he was a useful teammate, he was someone the Republicans could count on. Here is a newspaper depicting Teddy Roosevelt, who was president during part of the congressional hearings, showing that he was happy that there was no race suicide in Utah, showing that, yeah, the Mormons, they fit within the broader nation, which shows the racial dynamics of this. This was an important step in the Mormon GOP alliance. Another big thing to Smoot's victory was that they could never prove that Smoot himself was polygamist. And so even if the Mormons still practiced polygamy, Smoot was innocent. There was lots of investigation, at one point sending investigators down to Mexico to find an alleged wife, plural wife of Reed Smoot, that they never could. And then my favorite line, not just from the Smoot hearing, but one of my favorite lines in Mormon history in general, was a Republican senator from Pennsylvania who, referencing the seedy nature and rumors of the private lives of the other senators, said this: "I would rather have a polygamist who doesn't polyg than a monogamous who doesn't monog." And that's why Reed Smoot was able to keep his seat in the Senate. He went on to serve for 3 decades, being one of the most powerful senators. Here you have a magazine cover with him showing the power of his position. He would later be part of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and lots of other important measures. One other remnant is that the church continued to move along the lines of separating from their past of polygamy. Now, it is unclear how determined Joseph F. Smith was to stamp out polygamy in 1905 and 1906, even with removing those 2 apostles. But by 1909 and 1910, Joseph F. Smith and the church leadership proved true to their word, and they put out a conquest to try to stamp out new polygamous sealings. And it was during that time that John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley, who were before removed from the Quorum of the 12, were now further disciplined. Taylor was excommunicated, and Cowley was disfellowshipped. But I think the best summary of this whole episode comes from the scholar Kathleen Flake. I'll talk about her book in a minute, who put it this way, that through the Smoot ordeal, the LDS Church learned to start acting more like a church and less like a nation, and the U.S. government learned to start acting more like a democratic nation and less like a church. That puts it quite well. As I mentioned before, this was one of those consequential moments in Mormon history. It would be hard to find more consequential moments like this one. It changed the way the U.S. government approached the Mormon tradition. It changed the way the Mormon tradition approached the U.S. government. It cemented the church's move away from polygamy, and it caused divides within the Quorum of the 12, including the removal of 2 apostles that would cause ripples for long afterward. Thankfully, because it's such an important moment, we have some wonderful scholarship. The book that I strongly recommend everyone read is Kathleen Flake's book, The Politics of American Religious Identity, The Seeding of Reed Smoot, a Mormon Apostle, published by the University of North Carolina Press a couple decades ago. It's short, it's only 150 pages, it's character-driven, it's smart, legal analysis, political analysis, and history. It gets into how Mormons re-centered their memory as a result of this moment that looked more to Joseph Smith's origins rather than his polygamy. It's a great, great book. It's one of my 5 favorite books in Mormon history. I also recommend, if you want a variety of historians' takes on this episode, Michael Paulos and Condon Smith Hansen published The Reed Smoot Hearings, a collection of edited essays that include a number of important articles from great historians on topics related to the Smoot hearings, including the final publication of D. Michael Quinn's before his demise a few years ago. And then finally, Michael Paulos, who is one of the co-editors of that volume, also edited the volume The Mormon Church on Trial, which is a collection of the text from the official record of the Smoot hearings. If you want to get into the primary sources themselves, that volume, The Mormon Church on Trial, published by Signature Books, is a phenomenal resource. I hope you do dig into it, because as I mentioned several times, it's one of the most consequential moments in Mormon history. And if you want to know anything about Mormon history, you have to know about the Reed Smoot trial. It's also a testament, a reminder of why history has never been more relevant than it is today, because we're once again addressing these questions of religious belonging and denominational intervention and what are the limits of citizenship. All topics that were also touched on in the Reed Smoot trial. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others, consider subscribing to the channel. If you want to give back, you can also become a member. Please also consider subscribing to my Kit newsletter so you won't miss all my other activities. As I mentioned, history has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why these conversations remain so important.